All right, 1 Peter chapter 4. And last week we looked at the first half of chapter 4, verses 1 through 11, where Peter really wants the Christians that he's writing to really take seriously the commitment that they've made. They've made a commitment to God, they've made a commitment to each other, that they're going to be there for each other. He tells them to love each other fervently. One of the points that we made last week was that sometimes we think that the arguments that we have as Christians, one, are new to Christians, or that they're even unique to us as Christians. This just because we're people and people have arguments with each other. But Peter is not a stranger to that kind of to church fights. And so the way he addresses it is to tell them, in your relationship with each other, I want you to love each other so strongly that you can cover even those kind of problems. So even when we have disagreements within each other, even when we are strongly in opposition to each other, we can choose not to be offended by each other. And we made the point that, especially back in Peter's day, there was only one church in the city. And it was probably a small church, like our size, or maybe even smaller than our size. So if two people fall out and can't stand each other anymore, where's that other person going to go? There is no other church for them to go to. Which means if a church was to split, if people were to stop going because of the people that they're arguing with, those people are most likely just going to fall away altogether and be lost. So for the health of every person in the whole church, it's necessary for each one of us to be able to overlook the slights and problems and arguments that we have, and be able to say, look, yes, that person's really aggravating, but the good of the church is more important than my aggravation towards that person. So that's why Peter says, fervently love each other. He ends it in verse 11. He says, whoever speaks, let him speak as it were the utterances of God. Whoever serves, let him do so as by the strength which God supplies, so that in all things God may be glorified through Jesus Christ, to whom belongs the glory and dominion forever and ever. Peter doesn't spend a whole lot of time here or anywhere else in 1 Peter talking about gifts of the Spirit. Paul talks about those a lot, right? And those aren't necessarily miraculous gifts. It includes miraculous gifts, but it's everything from being able to do miracles, to being able to teach, to being able to be hospitable. But Peter's point to them is, whatever your gift is, make sure that the way that you use it is to glorify God. Not to glorify yourself, but that the way that you use it is to serve Christ, which in this context means, or includes, serving the church that you're in. Which fits quite nicely with what Paul said over in Corinthians when he addresses this subject. He makes that point about, if you have the ability to speak in tongues but nobody can interpret, then your gift is not useful to the church, and therefore you should be silent. So it's not about whether you can speak in tongues or not. It's about, is it useful to the church? And that's exactly the same point that Peter's making there in verse 11. The whole point of what he's getting at here in the first half of 4 is, take what you've got, whatever it might be, use it to the glory of God, to the service of the church. That's what's really, really important. All right, this week I want to look at verses 12 through 19, so the second half of chapter 4, where he does move on to another topic. He begins with this concept of the fiery ordeal. He says, beloved, do not be surprised at the fiery ordeal among you, which comes upon you for your testing, as though some strange thing were happening to you. But to the degree that you share the suffering of Christ, keep on rejoicing, so that also at the revelation of his glory you may rejoice with exultation. If you are reviled for the name of Christ, you are blessed, because the Spirit of glory and of God rests upon you. By no means let any of you suffer as a murderer, or a thief, or an evildoer, or as a troublesome meddler. But if anyone suffers as a Christian, let him not feel ashamed, but in that name let him glorify God. For it is time for judgment to begin with the household of God. And if it begins with us first, what will be the outcome for those who do not obey the gospel of God? And if it is with difficulty that the righteous is saved, what will become of the godless man and the sinner? Therefore, let those who suffer according to the will of God entrust their souls to a faithful Creator in doing what is right. So he says in verse 12 that there's going to be a fiery ordeal, or maybe there's already a fiery ordeal, and they're not supposed to be surprised at it. So the first question we have to ask is, well, what is this fiery ordeal? And of course, since he uses the word fiery, we immediately think of Christians being burned at the stake, or something like that. And that did happen to Christians. There are stories of Nero, who is the emperor at this time, actually literally putting Christians on torches in his garden and lighting them on fire to light his garden, which is, of course, totally barbaric. But it happened. It probably hasn't happened yet at the point that Peter is writing. So even though that's coming, and he may have that in mind, that this sort of thing will happen, but still, persecution even like that is persecution that happened at particular localities, like Rome. And at particular times, at this point in the Roman Empire, there wasn't a policy for the whole empire saying, we need to go out and kill and torture and exterminate the Christians. At particular cities, at particular times, under particular governors, there were moments of persecution, possibly even to the point of torture and death. But it wasn't a big deal yet. That's coming. And Peter may have that in mind, but probably not quite to the extent that we're thinking. Probably not the big persecution that he has in mind. So it's probably not actually a reference to burning at the stake. What's probably a little more likely is a theme that comes out of the Old Testament. For example, over in Zechariah, we see it a lot in the, particularly in the prophets of the latter part of Judah and Israel. Zechariah, chapter 13. 13 and verse 9. And God says, and I will bring, he's talking about the remnant of Israel that he's going to save, and he says, and I will bring the third part through the fire, refine them as silver is refined, test them as gold is tested. They will call on my name, and I will answer them. I will say, they are my people, and they will say, the Lord is my God. Lots of other verses like that. It's a theme out of the Old Testament of refining by fire. That if God wants to test his people, if he wants to know that they're faithful, if he wants them to prove that they're faithful, then you need to refine them with fire. He needs to refine them with fire. So that's probably more what Peter's got in mind here, that there is a time of testing on them or coming on them, and in this testing, you're going to have the opportunity to prove your faith. He says, but don't be surprised about it, as though it was something that, some strange thing, he says, was happening to you. We tend to think of suffering and not suffering as, as the normal course of events for life is to have a quiet, peaceful, calm life. And that when suffering comes, well, we accept that it does come and it must come, but it's an abnormality that we need to get through as quickly as possible so we can go back to life as it normally is. That's how we tend to think of suffering. But actually, that's probably not true, the way that we think of it. The normal response when you're suffering is to stop doing the thing that is causing you to suffer. And that's how we tend to do it, or that's how we tend to respond to pain. But Peter wants them to stay faithful despite the suffering. And sufferings will come, and they may be just disasters of some sort, like a fire or tornadoes, that sort of thing. Those can cause sufferings. Really, both the suffering and the peace is normal. For example, when we think of war and peace, again, we have this conception that peace is the way we want things to be. Occasionally we have wars, we fight them, we get them over with, and then we go back to being peaceful. And actually, for the United States, that has been fairly true, where we're mostly at peace and occasionally at war. But actually, over all of human history, war and peace are just as normal as the other. In fact, war is, if anything, more normal than peace for most of time. People have been more at war than they have been at peace. I've been listening to some podcasts on the Roman Empire, and they had a temple. I've forgotten which temple it was now. There's a temple in Rome, and the tradition was that when there was peace, the doors would be closed. Probably going to get that backwards, but the doors would be closed if they were at peace. And if they were at war, then their doors would be open. And several Roman historians make a note that the doors were almost always open. They were almost always at war with somebody. And that was just kind of the normal way it was. So war and peace, we tend to think that peace is the way things ought to be and that war is just an occasional thing, but actually war is just as normal, and if anything more normal than peace. So, we are lucky over here. We've got enormous oceans on both sides of us, so and we have friendly neighbors to the north and south. We've only got 2 neighbors, which means that no American living has seen their house burned by a marauding army. That hasn't happened in our country since the Civil War, and then only to people down in the south. So that just doesn't happen to us. It does happen to the rest of the world. Even the Europeans, there are people living in Europe who can remember seeing invading armies come through their countries. Jack?
Probably a little off subject, but just to highlight why in other countries throughout Europe, Africa, and Asia, war has been more prominent in its history than in the United States. Another factor, as well as the oceans, which have been a great benefit to us, kind neighbors, though that is in part perhaps because the freedom and the right to own private property in the Western Hemisphere is somewhat new in human history. The last couple hundred years. Prior to that, wealth was mostly obtained by confiscation of someone else's property.
Right.
Roman Empire, the Greek Empire before it, the Medes and the Persians, the Babylonians, often got their increased wealth, or were able to increase wealth by marauding other nations near them and plundering them. So you're constantly, if you're trying to increase prosperity, plundering your neighbor.
Right.
And so the way of war was commonplace, but there was something new in that experiment across the ocean from Europe in the New World, where it was tried differently, and that wealth could be created by the right to an individual to own his own property, to put that property to work and maybe even gain, and wealth could be created rather than taken from another. And maybe that's another variable as to why we've not been as much a history of war as has been the history of the human experience.
Right. There's lots of things that go into it, but taking it all together, what we have is contrary to our American experience. The experience of the world, the experience of people is that suffering happens a lot, more, in other words, than it does to us. Peter, in other words, Peter is not talking about some fantasy world. He doesn't have his head in the clouds. He is not some sort of idealistic Christian talking about how things ought to be. Peter is addressing how things are. Whether we're talking about war or any other kind of suffering, it's going to happen. These guys are suffering because of Christ. So this is not some random war that just happens to come across and just happens to be where they live. These guys are suffering in some measure because they are Christians. This is something, again, this is something that us Americans really can't relate to. Suffering because you're a Christian back in their day, so under the Roman Empire, we talked about this a couple weeks ago, that for the Romans and for the Greeks, it didn't really matter which god you believed in, but you were expected to be respectful and honoring to all the gods. So Zeus or Apollos might be your particular deity, and that was fine. But you were supposed to respect the other ones too, and give them at least a little bit of service. You didn't need to be really faithful to them, but you needed to give your particular, whatever was expected of you in the society that you lived, you were expected to do that. And you were expected to be respectful of all the gods. The Christians are suspect in what they do because they only worship one, a new one. That itself is suspicious. And their attitude toward all the rest is not one of respect and honor. Their attitude toward the rest is those are false, those are fake, those are not real. And you ought not to be worshiping them. They're also very evangelistic, meaning that they want to change these pagans into Christians. And we think, well, what's wrong with that? Well, for the pagans, you Christians are trying to subvert the natural order of the family. Our family has been followers of Zeus for generations. You are coming in, horning in, trying to take my daughter, my son, my uncle, whatever, and take them out of that natural order, the way things ought to be, and pull them over into basically this weird cult. And so, whether they knew anything about the rest of Christian doctrine, those things all by themselves marked them as very, very suspicious. Very, very, just completely contrary to the way things ought to be as far as the Romans and the Greeks were concerned. Which means that, for the most part, even when there wasn't a specific policy of persecution, the Romans took a very dim view of the Christians. Last week, I think I read from Pliny, where he wrote to the Emperor Trajan, about maybe 50 years or so after Peter wrote, from the same area that Peter is writing to. And he said to the emperor, I found some Christians, I executed a couple of them, just for being Christians, but then I started wondering about it, so I tortured a couple of them to find out what they believed, and I didn't find anything particularly bad, but what should we do about them? And the emperor wrote back, well, if you find them, go ahead and execute them, but don't spend a lot of time looking for them, basically. So in other words, Pliny, who is a perfectly educated, reasonable sort of guy for a Roman, finds some Christians. He's the governor. He finds some Christians, and he immediately has them executed because they are so far out of the norm. There's another story from not too long after that, of a Roman governor who arrested a Christian, an upstanding man of the community, and at his trial, he asked him, are you a Christian? And the man said, yes, I am. And the judge said, okay, away with you to the lions, and sent him off to be executed. And one of the spectators stood up and said, wait a minute, why did you do that? That guy's not a murderer, he's not a thief, he hasn't done anything wrong. Why did you pass that sentence of judgment on him? And the judge said, are you a Christian? And the guy said, well, yes, I am. So he said, okay, arrest you, and off you go to the lions that day. And another guy stood up and said, wait a minute, neither of these guys have done anything wrong. And the judge said, are you a Christian? And he said, yes, I am. He said, okay, officers, arrest him. Off he goes to the lions too. In other words, it wasn't that they had done anything morally bad. The mere fact that they're Christians, that they worship the one God, that they don't give respect to the traditional deities, all that, all by itself, is enough to condemn them to death. And these Christians who become Christians are perfectly aware that that is likely to happen. So, again, there is not an empire-wide policy of arresting every Christian that you can find and sending them off to the arena. But when they do find them, that's going to happen. So they're not really looking for them precisely, but that is the sort of suffering that's going to happen. Like I said, for us Americans, we really can't relate to this. We are in a country that from the beginning, many of the people who immigrated before there was any country to immigrate to, the Puritans and some of those people came for religious freedom. And we've had the very first amendment to our Constitution, the very first provision of the Bill of Rights is the freedom of religion. And so we are in a society, and have been for 200 plus years, where we believe that everyone is free to worship. I may think you're worshiping a weird God, but you are free to worship that way. I may try to convince you that you're wrong, but I can't go to the government and say, that guy is worshiping weirdly and ought to be arrested and killed because he's worshiping weirdly. That just isn't going to happen here. There are parts of the world where it does happen. If you were a Christian in Iran and you get found out, you're going to get stoned. If you are a Christian in Cuba, which is still communist, and you get found out, you're going to get shot. If you're a Christian in China, you're probably not going to get, you might not get killed if you're in China, Christian in China, but you're probably going to suffer. You may well lose your job. You're going to lose, contacts, business contacts, and that sort of thing. Lots of places in the world, even places like, we have some friends that used to be associated with this church that are working as missionaries in Bulgaria. And their last letters on the board back there, they were saying they had a great difficulty getting permission to come and stay in the country for 6 months or 12 months, whatever they were trying to do, because they were applying as missionaries. The Bulgarian government, and this is in Europe, this is Eastern Europe, relatively free part of the world, didn't really want Christian missionaries coming in and working in their country. So we talk about suffering, but we really don't relate to the kind of suffering that Peter's talking about, and that Christians back then, Christians in lots of the rest of the world, are dealing with. So for those Christians in China and Cuba and Iran, reading what Peter said is very valuable to them, because they can relate to what Peter's got in mind here. And what he tells them in verse 13, to the degree that you share the sufferings of Christ, keep on rejoicing, so that at the revelation of his glory you may rejoice with exultation. So first of all, we're sharing the sufferings of Christ. And that really is one of the big themes of 1 Peter. The sufferings of Christ and our sharings in them. Really, the example of Christ. Everything we do is supposed to be following the example of Christ. Well, one of the things that Christ did was suffer. And so as Christians, we very well may be called on to suffer for being a Christian. That's what I've been trying to get at with all these Christians in the empire. They weren't suffering because they had done anything wrong. They were suffering merely for identifying themselves as Christians, separate and apart from any other action that they had done. Simply by saying, I am a Christian. They're going to suffer for that. Jeff?
Question. From what you've taught from 1 Peter chapter 4 thus far, I guess I would gain that there's an expectation that it is commonplace for a Christian to suffer for being a Christian. Separating that from, as you talked about, sufferings from war or natural calamities. These are sufferings that may be separated and distinguished from those would be those brought about by your own actions or beliefs.
Right.
If it's commonplace or spoken of in Scripture as being commonplace for Christians to suffer, it shouldn't be anything we're surprised by. In fact, it should be expected that we should be suffering because of our actions and deeds as Christians, and we are not. Might it be not because we're not in Iran or Europe, or because we have a freedom of religion guaranteed in that first of the Bill of Rights? Might it be because those who are complacent and inactive don't suffer because of their action? Might it be that, yes, we have advantages, but perhaps those advantages have caused American Christians to be complacent and not doing enough in the name of Christ to bring about any suffering?
Yeah, if we're supposed to suffer, how come we're not? That's a good point, and it's one I've been contemplating a lot in this study and other ones also. The first thing, I don't want to trivialize the suffering that Peter is talking about. Sometimes we have these discussions, well, how are we suffering today? And we say, well, we get mocked because we're a Christian. That's not the kind of suffering that Peter's got in mind. You get mocked for any kind of belief. If you believe the moon is made of cheese, you're going to get mocked. But that's not suffering. That's just a response to somebody thinking that you have a silly belief. So if somebody believes Christians are silly, that they believe something silly, they're going to mock you. That's not the kind of suffering that Peter's got in mind. And so I don't want to make too trivial a connection between the suffering that Peter has in mind and any suffering that we deal with. So should we suffer as Christians? Is it absolutely necessary that we suffer in some manner like what Peter's talking about? I'm starting to think that maybe not. Just because the suffering that he's got in mind is the reaction of the society around them to their belief. Our society is very tolerant of Christians and of pretty much anything else. So any reaction from them to us, and we're talking general terms here, of course, is going to be relatively peaceful. There are Christians, there are churches that have suffered for taking a stand against homosexual marriage. There are churches that have suffered for, let's see, that's the biggest one that comes to mind. So there are churches and Christians in particular places. I remember hearing about a church in San Francisco that had been publicly preaching against homosexuality. And of course, there's a large homosexual community there, and there were some riots and things like that. So it does happen. But it's not widespread. I'm not sure that I would say that take a general Christian and say, well, he's not suffering in the sort of way that he is, that these guys in Peter are, therefore he must not be doing enough of something. If he was enough of a Christian like he's supposed to be, then he would be suffering. I'm not quite sure we can make that argument, because this is such an anti-Christian society that Peter's writing to. We're just in such a not anti-Christian society compared to Peter's society that we're not going to see that same level of suffering.
Well, though, on the contrary, maybe not so much that we're a more tolerant society, certainly we are, and we certainly are correct not to trivialize their suffering by comparing it to our life of ease as a Christian in America. 100% agree that we ought not to trivialize that, and that this apples and oranges, not apples to apples.
Right.
However, we also, in American Christianity, in our churches in the United States, would often be of the mind that if I'm in a community where stating something so boldly would be counterproductive to reaching the masses, or might be offensive to the community which we're in, we might tone it down a bit so as not to be an offense, and we might be able to reach those within our community with compassion and love. So
Sure.
If we're in a hotbed of homosexual relationships, we would generally in America, rather than being bold in the pronouncement of that being condemned by God, we would soften our approach. We would teach one another in our churches to soften the approach and not be so condemning and off-putting.
Sure.
So would the lack of suffering for the cause of Christ be because of a more tolerant society, or a less strong-willed,
A lack of boldness.
provocative Christian church?
Yeah.
Perhaps a church that cares more about being a friend of the world and fitting into its community than standing for the cause of Christ.
Right.
Which one? I'm not sure that one is because it's a more tolerant society. Maybe it's because it's a more tolerable Christianity.
We're Americans, and Americans are tolerant people. We are American Christians, and that attitude is going to be a part of our experience of being a Christian. So I guess probably what we probably ought to conclude is...
Oh, I got another thing before you conclude. I can't help myself right now.
Go ahead.
The spirit within me just must leap out with this. The phrase American Christians, and I mean no harm whatsoever. I love your teaching. But it just strikes to mind how often many of us, and I don't see a black person here, so I'm going to be so bold as to say a lot of white folk don't like the phrase African American, Hispanic American, let's say German American, English American. No, we want to say we're just American.
Right.
We don't like those adjectives thrown before.
Right.
They're divisive. I understand that we are American Christians. And that Americanism that is who we are, the culture in which we were raised and bred and learned, influences us. Maybe more than it ought.
Maybe.
But it certainly does. That's inescapable. But should there be Iranian Christians, American Christians, African Christians, or should we be Christians only? I know we don't like Methodist Christians, Lutheran Christians, and Presbyterian Christians, but the other adjective is the fact that we are American Christians, Christians living in America, born, raised, and reared here, influenced by our culture, excusable for not being Christians as Christ would have us be without regard to the culture of our upbringing.
Right.
And perhaps we have become too complacent in accepting friendship with the world. And we're ineffective in bringing heathens to Christ, if you will, to use the term heathens, non-believers being believers in Christ because of our complacency.
It's quite possible. And where I was going with that is, I think what we need to do as Christians is ask ourselves that question. Are we, as an American Christian, given all the factors around us, all the way we were brought up and the culture we're in, you look at ourselves, look at the way that we respond to opportunities to share our faith or to be bold and stand up and say, no, that's wrong. Are we being too complacent? The answer may be no, we're not being complacent. Maybe it is the proper thing to not jump down their throat at this particular situation. Other times, maybe we should be more bold. And so I think that's really the question we need to address to ourselves. How do we handle that? And sometimes, I don't think there is one answer. We always ought to be more bold. That's not a bad answer, but there are times to be more gentle.
Maybe it's not, we don't have to maybe look at the suffering issue so much, but whether or not are we taking advantage of the freedom here, you know, and or getting sidetracked by other things. Because we do have an advantage that we can speak freely, so are we using that, you know, to our full advantage?
Steve?
Yeah, I'm just thinking that we are planning on acting bolder with our evangelism in August.
Yep.
And I think that's a good step.
Good. Yep. Yep. All right. So to get back to what Peter's getting at here, these Christians are suffering, or they're going to suffer. Suffering to some degree. He doesn't go into a whole lot of specifics about exactly what kind of suffering, but they are going to suffer. What he wants them to know is not so much that they should enjoy. He says to take joy in their suffering. I don't think it's so much be happy that you're sad or be happy that you're hurting, but the joy is first of all that you're following the example of Christ. Our whole goal in being a Christian is to be like Christ. So if you can say, I'm suffering for being a Christian, not because of what I did, but just for being a Christian, first of all, you're following the example of Christ, so that's something to take joy in. And also, it goes on in verse 14, if you are reviled for the name of Christ, again, not because of what you did, just because you have owned the name of Christ, you're blessed because the Spirit of glory and of God rests upon you. So in other words, your suffering for being a Christian is a glory to God. That's something to take joy in. Your suffering for being a Christian brings the Spirit of God on you in some fashion. He doesn't go into exactly what that means and how that happens and what does it mean that the Spirit of glory is on you, but it is. But perhaps just the fact that you are staying faithful and being willing when the judge says, Are you a Christian too? The guy is willing to say, yes, I am, knowing what's going to happen. The mere fact that he has the strength to do that may be the evidence of the Spirit of God on him. But all of this here really is getting to that in there, verse 13, at the revelation of his glory you may rejoice with exultation. These Christians are going to suffer in the short term, but they're going to have so much glory, so much rejoicing in the long term, and that is what these Christians should be keeping in mind. Remember, by the way, this is Peter who's saying this. What did Peter do when Jesus was arrested?
Deny it.
He denied him 3 times. 3 times they gave him an opportunity to say, yes, I belong to Christ. And 3 times he said no. In fact, the 3rd time he started swearing. I don't know the man. This is the guy who's writing this, who's saying, when you stay faithful, tremendous, you're following the example of Christ, tremendous glory is going to come upon you. So this is not a guy who has had an easy time or who doesn't know what the cost of affirming Christ. This is a guy who has had the challenge and failed it. And then, of course, came back and was very bold after that for Christ. But this is a guy, this is what I love about Peter. This is a guy that we can look to and we can identify with. We can say, wow, Peter's just like me. Sometimes he's really strong. Sometimes he's really weak. And yet, God found a way to use him. And so, the good news for us is, it doesn't really matter if you're like Peter or, like Paul. Either way, God can find a way to use you. Even if you deny Christ, He can still find a way to bring you back and use you.